Amani Lewis never believed in destiny until the night her mother, breath shallow and fading, gripped her hand and whispered the one sentence that would alter her entire life. "Find the man who destroyed our family. He carries the name Hawthorne." Those words haunted Amani long after the machines went silent. They became a promise, a wound, a mission. And now, standing before the iron gates of Hawthorne Estate, they became the reason her heart beat with equal parts fear and rage. Ethan Hawthorne, billionaire, cold as polished marble. A man carved from privilege and power, he was the enemy she had come to expose. At least, that was the story Amani repeated to herself like a prayer meant to harden her resolve. But nothing about Ethan matched the monster she imagined. Not the quiet intensity in his steel-gray eyes, not the exhaustion hidden beneath his composure, not the loneliness that flickered across his face when he thought no one was watching. And Amani watched him more than she should have. She felt ashamed each time she caught herself searching for meaning in the way he stood by the window at night, staring into the empty acres of his land as if waiting for something that would never return. Her mother had warned her, the Hawthorne men destroy everything they touch. Yet Amani could not shake the feeling that Ethan was also battling ghosts, ones he didn't dare speak aloud. She was supposed to investigate him, not understand him. She was supposed to hate him, not feel the sharp pull in her chest whenever he said her name with that low, restrained warmth. Still, the truth was cruel after only 1 week in his mansion. Amani wasn't just doubting her mission, she was doubting herself. And Ethan wasn't making anything easier. He had a way of looking at her as though she mattered, as though she wasn't just another face in his perfect, controlled world. It unsettled her. It tempted her. It terrified her. Yet the real twist began the night she found a hidden file in the archive room. A single folder labeled with her mother's name. Her breath froze. Inside were photographs, letters, medical reports, pieces of a past Amani didn't know existed, and none of it pointed to Ethan. Instead, every thread of evidence led to another man entirely, someone who had vanished years ago. Someone whose name was carefully erased, but not enough to disguise the truth. Another Hawthorne. Amani's hands trembled as she closed the folder. Realization slicing through her. She had been hunting the wrong man, but before she could run, flee, or even breathe, she heard Ethan's voice behind her, quiet, strained, almost broken. "Amani, why are you looking into my family?" She turned. Ethan stood in the doorway, shadows bruising the angles of his face, eyes blazing not with anger but with something far more dangerous, hurt. This was the moment she was supposed to confront him, accuse him, demand answers. Instead, all she could feel was the crushing weight of her mistake. Yet before she could speak, Ethan stepped closer, gaze locked on hers, vulnerability piercing through the armor he wore so well. "There are things I've tried to protect," he said, voice low, raw. Things that could destroy more than just me. Her heart thudded. Destroy who? His throat tightened as though he already knew the answer would change everything. You? Amani felt the world tilt, a new fear rising, one she hadn't expected. Because suddenly, the danger wasn't that Ethan was her enemy. The danger was that he might be the only man capable of breaking the promise she made to her mother, by making her fall in love with him instead. And for the first time, Amani wasn't sure which truth terrified her more. The rain had thinned into a mist by the time Amani Lewis reached the gates of Hawthorne Estate, though the clouds still hung low. casting the property in a muted, silver haze. She stood in front of the towering ironwork like a lone shadow. Her fingers curled tightly around the worn leather handle of her mother's old suitcase. Inside it, tucked between a faded sweater and a set of prayer beads, lay the letter that had dictated her entire fate. The letter that ended with one name, Hawthorne. Every time her eyes brushed over those 8 letters, her pulse kicked harder, as if her heart wanted to bolt from her chest before she even crossed the threshold. She had repeated the same sentence so many times since childhood that it had engraved itself into her bones: find the man who destroyed us. Now that she was here, the mission felt heavier than the suitcase she carried, and far more dangerous. The gates opened with a muted groan. Guided by unseen hands or hidden sensors she didn't care to identify. All Amani knew was that once she stepped inside, things she had held together for years, grief, hatred, purpose, might begin to unravel. Yet she walked forward anyway, because turning back had never been an option. The gravel crunched beneath her boots as Hawthorne Estate revealed itself piece by piece, sculpted hedges trimmed with military precision, lampposts casting amber light against the mist. And finally the mansion, an enormous structure of dark stone and glass that rose like some mythical creature carved into reality. It was beautiful in the way frozen lakes were beautiful, silent, sharp, and full of dangers lying beneath. When the front doors opened, Ethan Hawthorne stood waiting for her. She had prepared herself for a villain. She had imagined the face of a man capable of destroying her mother's life. But Ethan was not that man, at least not in appearance. He was too composed, too controlled, too devastatingly handsome for the monster she had constructed in her mind. At 35, he carried his power like a second skin, effortless, intimidating, impossible to ignore. The shadows of the entryway caught on the sharp lines of his jaw, the smooth fall of his dark hair, the cold clarity of his steel-gray eyes that locked on hers with unnerving intensity. Most people would look away. Most did. But Amani didn't. She held his gaze steadily, feeling the friction of 2 wills colliding in the quiet foyer. She expected a flash of irritation, a command, perhaps a warning. Instead, something flickered in Ethan's eyes, surprise, brief but unmistakable, followed by an attention that lingered half a second too long. He wasn't used to defiance, and she wasn't used to men like him. Amani introduced herself with the calm professionalism she had practiced the entire bus ride, but her heartbeat stuttered as Ethan's gaze drifted over her, not with desire, not with judgment, but with an almost analytical curiosity, as though he were trying to place her in a puzzle he didn't know he was solving. She felt the weight of his observation but refused to break her composure. She needed this job. She needed access. She needed answers. She followed him through the mansion, memorizing every hallway, every door, every detail she might someday use. But as she walked, something unexpected settled in her chest. Faint but persistent, a strange pull, like the house itself was watching her, or sensing her, or warning her. Ethan's voice broke through her thoughts as he showed her to the staff wing. His tone measured and polite, but distant. Still, she noticed things, small things she wasn't supposed to notice. The faint fatigue beneath his eyes, like he hadn't slept well in years. The way he paused before speaking, as though weighing every word. The slight tension in his shoulders when she asked a question too directly. He wasn't a man who liked unpredictability, and she was nothing but unpredictable. That night, after unpacking her mother's suitcase and placing the letter carefully in the bedside drawer, Amani wandered into the quiet stillness of the estate. She needed to see him again. Not because she wanted to, she absolutely didn't, but because every instinct in her told her that he was the key, even if he wasn't the answer. Secrets clung to the walls of this mansion. She could feel them. When she reached the west corridor, she froze. Ethan was there, seated on a window bench, the pale moonlight reflecting off the rain still clinging to the glass. His posture was relaxed, almost defeated, his fingers absently tracing the edge of a whiskey glass he hadn't touched. His gaze was distant, fixed on something invisible in the night. It was the first moment she realized he wasn't simply cold, he was lonely. And that struck her far deeper than she expected. This wasn't the expression of a man who destroyed families. This was the expression of a man carrying the weight of one. She studied him quietly, her breath shallow, her certainty shaken. How could someone with such emptiness in his eyes be the villain she was supposed to find? How could her mother's final request point her toward a man who looked like he'd been fighting his own demons long before she arrived? She stepped forward deliberately, making her presence known. Ethan turned, and the moment their eyes met, she felt it again, that stirring, magnetic pull she desperately wanted to ignore. His gaze dropped to the letter she held in her hand, though he couldn't know what it contained. But something in his expression shifted, sharpened, as if he could sense there was more to her than the role she claimed. "What brought you here?" "Amani," he asked, voice low enough to send a subtle tremor through her. She had practiced a dozen answers, all lies. But in that moment, the truth hovered on her tongue, not the full truth, but a dangerous sliver of it. "I needed a fresh start," she said softly. "Or are you chasing something?" His words were gentle, but the edge beneath them was unmistakable. Her breath caught. Maybe both. Ethan studied her, his eyes darkening slightly, as though her admission unsettled him more than he showed. For a heartbeat, the room seemed to shrink around them, drawing their breaths into the same rhythm. Amani felt the pull again, stronger this time, and she backed away quickly. Heart pounding. She couldn't afford to be swayed by him. She couldn't afford to feel anything for him. And yet, as she walked away, Ethan's voice reached her, softer than it had been all evening. "If you find what you're chasing, I hope it doesn't hurt you." The words lodged themselves deep inside her, unwelcome and warm. But the true jolt came hours later. While exploring the staff records to familiarize herself with the estate layout, Amani noticed a locked drawer in the archive cabinet, small, discreet, oddly out of place among mundane paperwork. A single metal tag was attached to it, H.L. Her initials and her mother's. A cold prickle slid down her spine. Why would her mother's initials appear in Ethan Hawthorne's archive? Why would anything connected to her family exist here? Buried in a drawer she wasn't meant to find. Her pulse thundered as she touched the lock, knowing it would take only a bit of patience and a hairpin to open. She knew she should wait, plan, think rationally. Instead, instinct overpowered caution. When the lock clicked open, her breath vanished. Inside was a photograph her mother, younger, smiling, vibrant, standing beside a man whose face was partly torn from the print, but unmistakably bore the sharp jaw and tall frame of a Hawthorne. Not Ethan. Someone older, someone missing. And beneath the photo, a note in elegant handwriting. "Keep this hidden." She must never know. The floor beneath her seemed to tilt. Her mother's warning had been real. The Hawthornes were involved. But the man in the photo was not Ethan. So why had her mother told her he was the threat? Why had she named him specifically with her dying breath? Amani's breath trembled as a new truth rose, a truth more terrifying than her hate or her mission. Either her mother was mistaken, or someone had wanted Amani to believe Ethan Hawthorne was the enemy, and she had just stepped willingly into his world. If Ethan wasn't the man who destroyed her family, then someone else in this house was, and that someone might be watching her right now. Amani had been in Hawthorne Estate barely a week, yet somehow the rhythm of the house had changed around her presence, as if the walls themselves adjusted to her footsteps. She worked quietly, moved gracefully, spoke only when necessary, yet there was something in the air now, something taut and humming, like a wire pulled too tight. Ethan noticed it before anyone else, though he pretended not to. He wasn't used to noticing things that didn't pertain to business or strategy or profit. But Amani Lewis, she pulled his attention like gravity. He hated that. Or perhaps he hated that he didn't hate it enough. Every time she crossed his field of vision, the sharp steel edges of his world softened slightly. It wasn't just her beauty, though. The contrast of her deep, warm skin against the pale light of the mansion never failed to arrest him. It was something quieter, something in the way she carried herself, steady and unbothered, as though she refused to shrink in a place designed to intimidate. She didn't rush around him like the staff who feared disappointing him. She didn't avert her eyes like someone afraid of being seen. Amani existed beside him, not beneath him. That alone set off something inside him he couldn't name. And Amani felt his gaze more often than she wanted to admit. His presence filled spaces like heat fills a room, powerful, invisible, undeniable. She told herself she was reading him only for the sake of her mission, studying her enemy the way her mother would have expected. But the truth was less convenient. Something about him unsettled her in ways she wasn't prepared for. Ethan Hawthorne was too composed, too observant, too haunted for the man she had been raised to despise. And the more she saw these cracks in his armor, the more her resolve wavered. She didn't want it to. One evening, after the rest of the staff retired, Amani slipped into the grand library to dust the shelves and reorganize a cart of books. She thought she was alone. She hoped she was alone, but as she crossed the threshold, a faint click echoed in the far corner. She froze, her breath catching in her chest. A soft, amber light illuminated part of the room, stretching toward a figure leaning against the carved mahogany table. Ethan. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He simply watched her with those unreadable gray eyes, the lamplight glinting off them like cold fire. It felt like stepping into a quiet storm, no sound, no wind, but a pull so deep it made her pulse stumble. She forced herself to continue working, refusing to let him see how aware she was of his gaze. She reached for a stack of books, but her hand trembled just enough that she hoped he hadn't noticed. Of course he had. Ethan was a man who noticed everything he wasn't supposed to. Amani. His voice broke the silence, deep and low, the tone curling down her spine like warmth and warning intertwined. She turned, slow and controlled, though her heart raced with a traitorous flutter. He pushed away from the table and approached her with deliberate steps. Not predatory, not aggressive, just certain, as if he were used to the world making room for him. When he stopped before her, the faint scent of cedar and rain clung to him, soft but intoxicating. "You've been distracting me," he said quietly, almost as if admitting a weakness he didn't understand. Amani's breath hitched, but she kept her chin lifted. "How?" Exactly, Ethan studied her for a long moment, his eyes lingering on the curve of her cheek, the tension in her jaw, the steady rise and fall of her breathing, in ways I don't have the vocabulary for. He answered softly, and the unexpected honesty of it nudged something vulnerable inside her. She should have stepped back, should have shut him down, reminded herself of the mission, the oath whispered into her ear by a dying mother. But Ethan moved closer, slowly, giving her every opportunity to step away. She didn't. Not until he lifted a hand, hesitant, almost gentle, and brushed his thumb across a loose strand of hair that had fallen near her cheek. The touch was feather-light, barely a whisper against her skin. But it sent a ripple of heat through her body so sharp she had to close her eyes for a heartbeat. She hated that her body reacted before her mind could protest. She hated the warmth, the softness, the betrayal of wanting more. She stepped back abruptly, breath shuddering. "Don't touch me." Ethan didn't advance. He didn't smirk or taunt her. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, studying her with an intensity that made her feel stripped bare. "Then why did you close your eyes when I did?" His voice was soft, speculative, almost tender. That made it worse. She turned away before he could see the confusion in her expression. "You're imagining things." "No," Ethan murmured behind her, his voice closer than she expected. "I'm noticing things. There's a difference." Amani's chest tightened. She couldn't allow this, whatever this was, to cloud her purpose. She needed answers about the photograph, about the Hawthorne brother her mother had never spoken of, about the secrets buried in this estate. She needed clarity, not the fog Ethan created with every word he spoke. But the moment she stepped into the hallway, she caught her reflection in the glass cabinet, a woman whose resolve was beginning to fracture. She didn't sleep that night. She lay awake, replaying the way Ethan had looked at her, not with hunger or dominance, but with something quieter and far more dangerous recognition. That frightened her more than any touch. The next morning, the mansion felt different, charged, expectant, as though the tension from the library had seeped into the walls. Ethan seemed more distant than usual, yet his silence wasn't cold. It felt like restraint, held tightly at the edges. Amani felt it every time he entered a room. She felt his attention slide toward her and away again like a controlled breath. She told herself to ignore it. She told herself to remember the promise she had made. But each time Ethan's eyes drifted toward her, even briefly, the promise blurred. Midway through the afternoon, she overheard two staff members whispering near the kitchen entrance. "He hasn't been this unsettled in years." One muttered, "Did you see him this morning pacing?" "He only paces when something matters." Amani's stomach nodded. She didn't want to matter to him. She didn't want to be the catalyst for anything in his world. But the thought that she might be terrified her in a way she wasn't equipped to examine. Later that evening, as she cleaned the hall near the west wing, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned sharply, heart stumbling into her throat, only to see Ethan standing in the doorway, hands in his pockets, expression unreadable. "You're avoiding me," he said. Not accusing, just stating. "I'm working," she replied, though her voice was too soft to be convincing. Ethan stepped closer, stopping a respectful distance away, though the air between them tightened instantly. "I make people nervous," he said quietly. "I'm aware of that. But when you walked away last night..." He paused, exhaling slowly. "It wasn't fear I saw in your eyes." Amani's pulse hammered. "What did you think you saw?" His gaze dropped to her lips, before returning to her eyes. Something I shouldn't name. Her breath trembled. She felt herself softening, cracking, falling towards something she knew she couldn't allow. So she drew in a slow breath and steadied her voice. "You don't know me, Ethan. I'm trying to," he murmured, almost vulnerable, "and I don't want you to." "That," he said gently, "is the first lie you've told me." The quiet certainty of it pierced her, because he was right, and that realization terrified her more than any secret she had uncovered in this house. She stepped past him, refusing to let him see the panic rising in her chest. Ethan didn't stop her. He didn't call after her. He simply watched her leave, his expression shadowed with something unreadable frustration, longing, regret. She didn't know, but she felt his gaze long after she disappeared around the corner. She returned to her room and closed the door, pressing her back to the wood. Her heartbeat thudded painfully, rhythm shaky and uneven. She touched the drawer where her mother's letter was hidden, grounding herself in the reason she had come here. "You are here to destroy him," she whispered silently, "not to want him." But her body still remembered the ghost of his touch, and her mind kept replaying the way his voice softened when he said her name. That was the night Amani realized the mission she thought she could control was slipping from her grasp, and the fire she intended to ignite under Ethan Hawthorne was beginning to consume her instead. Amani hadn't meant to stop outside Ethan's office. She had carried a tray of folders to be returned upstairs, mind drifting, feet moving by habit through the quiet, cavernous hallways of Hawthorne Estate. Then she heard his voice low, strained, nothing like the composed ice he wore around others. She froze without meaning to, breath catching as she registered the words. "I want everything re-examined," Ethan said sharply. "Every transfer, every signature, every timestamp. If someone is framing me, I want their name." A beat. Then the lawyer's voice, muffled but urgent. "The allegations resurfaced for a reason. Whoever orchestrated the original scandal might be pushing again." "I know," Ethan murmured, and his voice dropped lower, weighted with something she didn't recognize: exhaustion. Maybe. Or fear. "But I won't take the fall for what my father's enemies did. Not again." The words struck Amani like a physical blow. Her throat tightened, her fingers digging into the folders against her chest. Not again. Not guilty. Someone else. Someone unseen. And the case he was talking about: financial misconduct, false attribution, a ruined family business. It matched exactly what her mother had whispered on her deathbed. The truth she had used her last breath to pass on. A man named Hawthorne destroyed us. Amani's knees weakened. For years she had built her anger around a single name, a single face: this man, this cold, unreachable billionaire who lived behind walls of glass and power. But Ethan wasn't confessing. He was fighting to clear himself. If he was innocent, then who had her mother meant? A tremor ran through her, disorienting, unwelcome. She stood frozen in the dim hallway, pulse thundering, as she tried to make sense of the fracture running through everything she thought she knew. A soft click. The office door eased open. She didn't even have time to step away before Ethan stepped into the hall. One hand braced on the doorframe, his eyes storm gray and impossibly sharp, landed on her instantly. Amani's breath stopped. Not because of guilt, but because the look he gave her was too focused, too knowing, curious. Ethan murmured, head tilting slightly, "Very curious." The air seemed to shift around them, tightening. Amani straightened her spine, forcing calm. I wasn't listening. His voice dipped, velvety and subtly dangerous. Then why do you look like you just heard something you weren't supposed to? Heat rose in her cheeks, anger, confusion, something dangerously close to fear of what he would see if he kept looking at her like that. She lifted her chin. Maybe I'm just trying to understand what kind of man you really are. Something flickered across Ethan's face, not quite irritation, not quite amusement, but a razor-fine blend that made her pulse flick harder against her throat. Are you? He whispered, taking one quiet, deliberate step toward her, looking for truth, Amani, or looking for proof of the lies you came here believing. Her heart lurched. He was close enough now that she could see the faint shadow of stubble along his jaw, the tension beneath his tailored shirt, the controlled rise and fall of his breath. He didn't touch her. He didn't need to. His presence alone felt like contact, heat, and gravity, and something that made her feel suddenly, terrifyingly unsteady. You think you know why you're here, Ethan said softly. But you don't. Not yet. Her fingers tightened around the folders until the edges bit into her skin. Maybe you should tell me, she whispered, hating the way her voice trembled despite her resolve. His eyes darkened, not with anger, but with a kind of restrained intensity that made her chest tighten. Oh, I will, Ethan murmured. But not tonight, and not like this. He leaned in, not enough to touch, but enough that she felt the warmth of his breath brush her cheek, enough that every nerve in her body lit up like a struck wire. But be careful, he whispered, voice sinking dangerously low. If you keep digging, you'll find the truth. And I'm not sure you're ready for what it will do to you. Amani's breath hitched. Her pulse stumbled. She had come here believing Ethan Hawthorne was a monster, a destroyer. But now the ground beneath her was shifting, pulling her into uncertainty, into the pull she had been trying so desperately to ignore. And Ethan God. Ethan was looking at her like she was the one person in the world capable of undoing him. Amani forced herself to breathe, though the air felt thin, as if Ethan's presence consumed all of it. She stepped back not because she wanted to, but because her body needed the distance before she said something reckless or let something slip through the cracks in her composure. You think I'm afraid of the truth? She asked, steadying her voice even though her pulse still rioted. Ethan's eyes tracked every movement she made, the faintest crease forming between his brows. Not irritation, something softer, more complicated. No, he said quietly. I think you're afraid of finding the truth isn't what you want it to be. The soft honesty in his tone caught her off guard. It wasn't a taunt. It was almost protective. And that, more than anything, rattled her. Because it meant he saw more than she wanted him to. More than she meant to reveal. Amani swallowed hard, trying to find words that disentangled him from the knot tightening around her ribs. But how could she untangle anything when the man she was supposed to hate kept showing pieces of himself that didn't fit the monster she had built in her mind? Whatever I learn, she managed. I can handle it. Ethan's gaze dropped for the briefest second, as if he were studying her mouth, her breath, the tension she couldn't fully hide. When his eyes lifted again, something in them had softened and sharpened all at once. I don't doubt that, he murmured. I just wonder what it will cost you. A flicker of heat shivered through her, unwelcome, undeniable. She hated that he could do that. make her heartbeat stumble with nothing more than a few words and the weight of his attention. She hated it because somewhere inside the ache, a new question had taken root. What if he wasn't the man her mother meant at all? But she didn't have time to examine it. Because Ethan took one last step forward, slow, deliberate, and the hallway seemed to shrink around them. She could smell the faint scent of cedar and rain on his clothes, feel the warmth radiating from his body, sense the restrained energy coiled beneath his skin. He didn't touch her. She realized, with a soft shock, that he'd never touched her without permission, and yet her body reacted as if he had. "Amani," he said softly, "if you're going to listen at my door, you should at least ask me the questions you're dying to know." Her breath caught, her throat tightened, and she absolutely hated, that he was right. There were questions burning inside her, questions she had carried all her life, sharpened into weapons against a man who might not be the villain at all. "Then tell me," she whispered, meeting his gaze. "The scandal, the accusations. Were you involved?" A long silence, one that stretched thin, delicate, dangerous. Ethan didn't look away, didn't blink. "No," he said finally, simply, truthfully, "I wasn't." Amani's chest tightened, a painful mix of relief and dread. "But someone," Ethan continued, voice lowering, "wanted the world to think I was. Someone very determined." She felt the truth in his tone, not rehearsed, not calculated, raw and threaded with something old and wounded. "Who?" she breathed. Ethan's jaw flexed. Something shadowed his eyes. "If I knew," he said, "you and I wouldn't be having this conversation, and you wouldn't be in danger just by digging around me." Her stomach dropped. "Danger?" Ethan exhaled slowly, as if weighing what to say. "Someone orchestrated that scandal," he murmured. "Someone with resources. Someone who isn't done." The hallway seemed to darken around them, sound fading until she could hear nothing but the echoing beat of her heart. "Why tell me this?" Amani whispered. Ethan's gaze locked onto hers, unguarded for the first time since she met him. "Because," he murmured, voice barely above a breath, "if you're going to walk straight into the fire, I'd rather you see the flames for what they are." Something inside her twisted fear, confusion, and something unbearably tender, all tangled together. She had wanted a villain. But standing here, facing a man who carried secrets like scars and danger like armor, she felt something else rise inside her. Something that terrified her far more than hatred ever had. "Ethan." She whispered his name, slipping out before she could stop it. His breath hitched, just slightly, but enough to tell her that whatever existed between them wasn't one-sided. And that realization made the floor tilt beneath her. Ethan stepped back then, not far, but enough to release the unbearable pressure between them. Enough for her to breathe again. "Go get some rest, Amani," he said, voice steadier now, though his eyes still held the heat of the moment. "Because whatever you think you're uncovering, you're only at the surface." She didn't trust her voice, so she didn't answer. She simply held his gaze one last second, one too long, too charged second before turning away. But as she walked down the hall, she felt Ethan's eyes on her, heavy and unyielding, like a force she couldn't outrun. And the truth echoed through her with every step. If Ethan Hawthorne was lying, her heart wouldn't be reacting like this. And if he was telling the truth, Then she wasn't ready for the storm she had just stepped into. The late afternoon light slipped through the tall windows of the piano room, warm and honey-soft, settling over the polished black lacquer like a secret the house was trying to keep. Ethan had intended only to pass through. He never lingered here, never touched the piano his mother once played, but the sound stopped him in the doorway. A melody, fragile and aching, floated through the room. Not a practiced performance, not a show. Something closer to memory given breath. Amani sat at the piano with her head bowed slightly, fingers gliding with a tenderness that contrasted sharply with the tension she carried everywhere else. For once, she looked unguarded, breakable, human in a way that made Ethan's chest tighten with an unfamiliarly raw ache. He stood there longer than he should have, watching her silhouette against the warm glow, feeling that strange, unwelcome pull that had been growing like a shadow behind his ribs. She didn't notice he was there until the final note trembled into silence. Amani startled, her fingers freezing midair before she closed the piano gently, almost protectively. "I didn't know anyone was listening," she murmured, trying to fold her vulnerability back into herself. Ethan stepped inside, the door closing behind him with a low, padded click. "Where did you learn to play?" His voice came out softer than he intended, almost careful. She hesitated, gripping the edge of the bench as if grounding herself. "My mother," she said quietly. "She taught me when I was little, but she's gone now." The way her voice curved around those words, quiet, unsteady, hit him with something he wasn't ready for. Loss recognized loss. Ethan moved closer, slowly, as though approaching someone wounded who might run if he came too quickly. He lowered himself beside her, leaving a respectful space between them, but not enough to dim the warmth he felt radiating from her skin. Amani. Her name left him before he had time to filter it. His voice softened by something unguarded, almost foreign to his own ears. She turned toward him, and the look in her eyes wary, brittle. But searching did something to him he couldn't explain. "I didn't mean to intrude," Ethan continued, "but that piece, you didn't just play it. You felt it." Amani let out a breath, eyes drifting back to the keys. "It reminds me of her. Not the ending, but the part in the middle, where the melody collapses." She tapped a key absent-mindedly, creating a tiny spark of sound. It always felt like someone losing their way. Ethan swallowed, a faint burn settling in his throat. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't empty, it was weighted, shared, fragile in a way that made his heart beat slower, heavier. Then Amani looked up, and Ethan felt something inside him shift with a quiet, startling certainty. She wasn't afraid of him. She didn't look at him the way the world did, with calculation or caution or ambition. She just saw him, and that terrified him more than anything. He leaned in slightly, unable to stop himself, drawn by the invisible tether that had been pulling them closer since the day she stepped into his home. "You don't have to carry everything alone," he murmured. Amani's breath trembled, almost imperceptibly. "Neither do you," she whispered back. The space between them thinned until he could feel the soft warmth of her exhale brush against his lips. His pulse kicked hard. He didn't touch her. But God, he wanted to. His hand lifted halfway, hovering near her jaw, waiting for something: permission, courage, a sign. Her lips parted, a soft intake of breath that sent a rush of heat through him. He leaned closer, too close. Close enough to count the gold flecks in her brown eyes, close enough that the world outside the piano room felt irrelevant. Suspended. Their mouths were a breath apart. A heartbeat. A mistake waiting to happen, or a truth they could no longer deny. Then the door burst open. A sharp crack of intrusion shattered the air between them, snapping the fragile thread that had pulled their lips toward each other. Amani jerked back. Ethan stiffened, every muscle in his body tightening as though he'd been caught doing something forbidden. And standing in the doorway, framed by the dying glow of sunset, was a woman with beauty sharp enough to cut glass. Harper, Ethan's ex-wife. Her arms crossed loosely, posture relaxed, but eyes gleaming with pointed amusement. "Well," she drawled, her voice smooth as silk and twice as dangerous. "Seems I've interrupted something." Amani rose instantly, heart slamming against her ribs, the warmth of the near kiss evaporating into cold dread. Harper's gaze swept over her with the precision of a blade assessing, amused and unmistakably predatory. Ethan didn't stand, not immediately. He inhaled once, deeply, the mask sliding back over him until he was again the Ethan the world feared controlled. Unreadable, steel-edged. "Harper," he said, voice flat. "You weren't expected?" "Oh, Ethan." Harper laughed lightly, stepping inside as though she owned the room. "I was never particularly good at waiting for invitations." Her eyes flicked back to Amani, lingering with a smirk that made Amani's stomach twist. "You must be the new staff." The pause before staff landed like a slap. Amani forced her spine to stay straight, even as heat and humiliation coiled in her chest. She didn't speak. She couldn't not, with Harper's smirk sharpening. As though she'd already won a game Amani didn't know she was playing. Ethan rose at last, slow and deliberate. "Harper," he said again. But this time his voice held warning. She ignored him. Instead, she closed the distance until she stood far too close to Amani, her perfume sharp and cold in the air. "Let me give you a little advice, sweetheart." Her voice dropped to a confidential whisper, loud enough for Ethan to hear. "Men like Ethan don't fall in love. They get bored. And when they do," her eyes gleamed, "they replace you." Amani felt the words like a hand squeezing her heart hard. Merciless, Ethan stepped forward. "That's enough." Harper's smile widened, slow and victorious. "Why am I wrong?" She didn't look at Ethan when she asked. She looked at Amani, as though the answer she really wanted was written on the trembling edge of Amani's composure. Amani swallowed hard, trying to hold on to the strength she always carried like armor. But the room suddenly felt too bright, too revealing. She had seen glimpses of Ethan's softness, brief, fleeting, but what did she know of the man he had been with Harper? What if this woman wasn't lying? What if Amani was nothing but a passing distraction, a warm body to fill a cold house? Ethan took a breath, jaw tightening. "Harper, leave." But Harper wasn't finished. "Oh, darling," she said softly, her voice dipped in poisonous sympathy. "You think you're the first woman he brought into this house and made feel special?" Amani flinched. Ethan's face hardened. "Get out," he said, each word low, lethal. Harper simply arched a brow and stepped back with slow, triumphant grace. "I'll be in the atrium," she said over her shoulder as she sauntered away. "We have business to discuss. Don't leave me waiting." The door clicked shut. Silence collapsed over the room, suffocating. Ethan exhaled, raking a hand through his hair. Amani, don't. Her voice broke. She turned away from him, one hand braced on the piano as though she needed it to stay upright. The melody she'd played still clung to the air, but now it felt like a wound, exposed. Ethan moved closer, not touching, but close enough that she felt the gravitational pull she hated herself for responding to. She doesn't know you, he said softly. She doesn't get to say who you are to me. Amani closed her eyes. And who am I? She whispered. Ethan opened his mouth, but no answer came out, because he didn't know. Not yet. And the silence that followed was worse than anything Harper had said. Amani drew a shaky breath, stepping away from him before the ache in her chest grew too sharp to bear. I should go, she murmured, not running, but retreating from the edge of something too dangerous. Ethan didn't stop her. Couldn't. Not when his own heart was slamming against a truth he wasn't ready to face. Amani walked toward the door, but just before leaving, she paused, one hand on the frame, shoulders trembling in a way she hoped he couldn't see. She's wrong, Ethan said, voice low, rough. Amani didn't turn. Then prove it, and she walked out, leaving Ethan standing alone in the warm afterglow of the nearly kiss that might have changed everything if it hadn't broken first. The night settled over Hawthorne Estate like a velvet shroud, thick and breathless, swallowing sound and light until the hallways became long rivers of shadow. Amani moved quietly, almost carefully, as if the echo of Harper's interruption in the piano room still clung to her skin. Her heart wasn't steady yet, not after almost kissing Ethan, not after seeing the look in his eyes raw, unguarded, and feeling something inside her shift in a way she couldn't contain or even name. She needed air. She needed space. She needed anything that wasn't this confusing ache in her chest. But the estate had a way of cornering her when she least expected it. She turned a corner and froze. Harper stood there, waiting. Her back rested casually against the wall, arms crossed, one leg angled like she'd been lounging in ambush. Her smile sharpened the dim light. Evening, she purred. Amani inhaled slowly, refusing to show even a flicker of fear. What do you want? Harper pushed off the wall and moved toward her with the smooth grace of someone accustomed to owning every room she entered. When Amani tried to step aside, Harper shifted, blocking her path, forcing her back until cold plaster pressed against Amani's spine. You're brave, Harper murmured approvingly. I'll give you that. Most women fold the moment they see Ethan's past walking toward them. Amani lifted her chin. If you think I'm intimidated, you should be. Harper leaned closer, her voice dropping into a chilling whisper. If you were smart, you'd leave this place tonight. Ethan is not the man you think he is. Amani stared straight into those icy blue eyes, refusing to flinch. And you, our Harper's smile flickered, brittle at the edges. I'm the only one who ever understood him. Amani didn't look away. Funny, if you understood him so well, you wouldn't be his ex-wife. A soft hiss of amusement escaped Harper. Touché, but don't mistake a closed chapter for an erased one. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a white envelope, holding it between two fingers like a delicate weapon. Here, she said, tone dripping with false generosity. A gift. A little truth to go with your fantasies. Amani didn't take it. Harper tisked, then seized Amani's wrist with manicured fingers and pressed the envelope firmly into her hand. If you want to know why your mother died miserable and alone, Harper whispered, open it. Amani's pulse spiked. Her mother. Harper was reaching into the one place Amani wasn't armored. What do you know about her? Amani breathed. Harper stepped back. Satisfied? More than you think. And before Amani could question her, Harper turned away, her heels tapping down the corridor, echoing like mocking applause. Heart pounding. Amani gripped the envelope as if it burned. She should throw it away. Harper had motives, dark ones. Tangled with jealousy and the unsettling sense of possession she still seemed to feel toward Ethan. Whatever was inside the envelope was meant to hurt her, to break something, to push her away from Ethan. But her mother's name was a blade she couldn't ignore. Not when the truth had been buried so long she barely knew which memories were real anymore. Amani forced her hands to steady and slid her thumb beneath the flap. The envelope opened with a soft, traitorous sigh. She reached inside, expecting legal documents, financial ledgers, something tied to the scandal Ethan kept trying to untangle. Instead, photographs, glossy, old, worn at the corners. Her breath left her body as she lifted the first one. Her mother stood beside a man. Not Ethan. Not even close. The man in the photo looked older, sharper in features but with the same hawthorn bones, confident posture, silver-flecked hair at the temples, a gaze that hinted at inherited power. Written on the back in fading ink, Edward Hawthorne, Ethan's brother, the brother who vanished after the scandal that ruined her family. Amani's pulse roared in her ears, drowning out the distant hum of the estate's lights. Her mother had never mentioned this man, never mentioned any Hawthorne but one. Why? How deep were the lies she'd inherited, and why did Harper want her to see this, as if conjured by the thought? Harper's voice curled back into the silence behind her. Amani hadn't even heard her return. Now you understand, Harper murmured, eyes gleaming with triumph. Ethan didn't destroy your family, but he will destroy your heart. Amani tried to form words, questions, denials, anything but her mind was spiraling, the photograph trembling in her grip. And in the center of that spiral was Ethan. Ethan's eyes, Ethan's honesty, Ethan's almost kiss. She didn't know which truth hurt more, the one she had just discovered, or the terrifying possibility that Harper was right, and Ethan Hawthorne was becoming the one man who had the power to break her completely. Amani couldn't breathe. The hallway seemed to tilt around her, its ornate decor blurring as her gaze fixed on the photograph like it was a live thing pulsing in her hand. Her mother's smile, soft, shy, almost tender, stood in stunning contrast to the cold, commanding presence of the man beside her, Edward Hawthorne, Ethan's older brother, the ghost name that hovered at the edges of every scandal, every whispered rumor, the man who vanished when everything collapsed, a man her mother had never spoken of. Why? Why hide him? Why let her grow up believing Ethan was the villain when the truth pointed elsewhere, somewhere darker, messier, more dangerous? Harper watched the confusion drain the color from Amani's face, and satisfaction glimmered in her smile like a serpent uncoiling. You see it now? Amani shook her head, voice thin. This doesn't prove anything. Oh, but it does? Harper replied softly, stepping closer. Your mother knew Edward, intimately, it seems. And Edward was the one involved in the scandal, not Ethan. Yet your mother blamed the wrong brother. Her gaze sharpened. Or she wanted you to? Amani flinched as the words landed like blows. My mother would never lie to me. Wouldn't she? Harper whispered. People lie when they're in love. Dear, they lie even more when they're ashamed. A shadow passed through Amani's eyes, fear, anger, grief, all twisting together into something raw and disorienting. Harper saw it, fed on it. But don't worry, she added with a shrug. You weren't the only one Edward hurt. Amani's head snapped up. What do you mean? Harper hesitated just long enough for the dread to build, then delivered the words like a poisoned gift. Edward destroyed Ethan too. The world seemed to stop. Amani felt her heartbeat in her fingertips. You're lying. Am I? Harper's smile didn't reach her eyes. Edward stole from their family legacy, dragged Ethan into the scandal, and vanished before the fallout could touch him. Ethan took the blame. It nearly ruined him. A beat? It still might. Amani's breath caught, sharp and involuntary. Ethan, the cold, unreadable man she came here to hate, carrying wounds she had never seen. Her mother's suffering tied to the same man who shattered Ethan's life. The truth tangled in ways she had never imagined, each thread pulling tighter until she couldn't tell who was victim and who was perpetrator anymore. Harper stepped back, satisfied with the devastation she'd sown. So now you see, she said, her heels clicking faintly against the marble. Ethan isn't responsible for what happened to your family. She paused, tilted her head, and smiled in a way that made Amani's blood run cold. But he will be responsible for what happens to you. Amani's stomach dropped. What are you talking about? You asked earlier if I knew Ethan better than you, Harper said. Let me offer one last piece of advice. Her voice turned low. Dangerous. Ethan doesn't break rules. He breaks people. That's what his father taught him. And trust me. Her gaze softened cruelly. You're not strong enough to survive the way he hurts. Amani's fingers curled around the photograph, knuckles whitening. You don't know me. I know you're already shaking. Amani's breath hitched, but she forced her shoulders back, forced her chin up. I'm not afraid of him. Harper laughed quiet, pitying. You're not afraid yet, but you will be. Something in Amani snapped, then not into anger, but into clarity, sharp and sudden. This is about you, she said, not me. You're threatened because he looks at me differently than he ever looked at you. Harper didn't flinch, but the small twitch in her jaw was victory enough. Even if that were true, Harper murmured, it won't last. She stepped into the shadows of the hallway, her voice dropping to a final whisper that struck deeper than any confession. When Ethan undoes you, don't say I didn't warn you. And then she disappeared. Amani stood alone, her breath unsteady, her heart pounding a wild, disjointed rhythm. She stared at the photograph again, at her mother leaning into Edward Hawthorne's side, trust softening her features. Why didn't you tell me? A question aimed at a ghost who would never answer. The walls felt too tight, the air too thin. She pressed her hand to her chest, trying to steady the storm Harper had ignited. She had come to Hawthorne Estates seeking a villain, a target. Justice wrapped neatly in a single name. But now the truth was cracking open like a fault line, and Ethan was no longer the enemy she'd painted in her mind. He was something else, something infinitely more dangerous. Because if Edward Hawthorne had ruined her family, and Ethan had suffered because of him, then the man Amani feared most wasn't the one who held her mother's past. It was the one who now held her heart. And that realization wasn't a warning. It was a threat she didn't know how to outrun. Avoiding Ethan was supposed to be easy in a mansion this large. But it turned out to be the most impossible thing Amani had ever attempted. Hawthorne Estate had endless hallways, hidden doors, entire wings she hadn't even explored. Yet somehow, Ethan always found her quietly, inevitably, as though their paths were drawn toward each other by something far more relentless than coincidence. She avoided the west wing. He appeared in the east. She slipped into the library at dawn. He walked in minutes later, claiming he needed a file he had never touched before. She lingered in the garden long after sunset to breathe, to think, to convince herself she was still in control, only for Ethan to step through the shadows like he had been searching for her without even realizing it. And every time their eyes met, she felt that tremor again, the one she tried to bury under anger. Suspicion, purpose, the one that refused to die. The night the storm hit, the sky cracked open with thunder, and rain slammed against the glass walls like the world itself had lost patience. Amani moved quickly through the dim corridor, clutching a stack of linens she didn't actually need to deliver, using work as her last excuse to outrun her own heartbeat. She told herself she wasn't hiding. She told herself she merely needed space to think. But her pulse betrayed her. Her breath betrayed her. And when she turned a corner and nearly collided with the broad, unyielding form of Ethan Hawthorne, she realized her entire body betrayed her too. He caught her wrist before she could retreat. His grip warm, steady, not forceful, but impossible to ignore. The storm outside roared, but his voice cut through it deep, quiet, threaded with something he no longer cared to restrain. Amani. Her name in his mouth sounded nothing like it should have. It wasn't a command. It wasn't a warning. It was need. Simmering, raw, barely contained. She swallowed, her breath uneven. "You need to let me go." Ethan stepped closer, the shadows drawing around him like he belonged to them. Why the word was soft, dangerous, intimate. Amani forced herself to look away, though his fingers still circled her wrist, his warmth seeping into her skin like a confession. "Because," she whispered, "you're confusing me." Ethan's jaw tightened, and then he moved slowly, deliberately closing the distance between them until the thunder outside was nothing compared to the thunder inside her chest. "Then let me make it clear." He pulled her into his arms, not harshly, not desperate, but firmly, as though he had been holding himself back for so long that the restraint finally snapped. Amani's breath caught. Her hands pressed against his chest, meaning to push him away. But instead she felt the quiet tremor beneath his ribs, the strain in his muscles, the vulnerability he hid from everyone, but couldn't hide from her. His forehead rested near her temple, breath warm against her skin, his voice a low, unsteady whisper. "I don't know who hurt your mother," he said, "but it wasn't me." Amani froze, not because of fear, but because those words carried a weight heavier than truth. They carried desperation, a vow. She could feel his heartbeat through his shirt, her ears so close to his chest she could hear how uneven it was. Ethan Hawthorne, controlled, unreadable, powerful, was unraveling for her, and that terrified her more than any threat Harper could deliver. "Ethan," she breathed, her voice breaking. "I can't. This isn't—" "Yes, you can." His hand lifted to her cheek, stopping just short of touching her, giving her the chance to pull away. "Because you feel what I feel. Amani, you know you do." She hated how true that felt. She hated how her body leaned toward him despite every warning in her mind. She hated how easily he could dismantle her with nothing but honesty. Lightning flashed through the corridor, illuminating the fractured longing in his eyes. "I'm not your enemy," Ethan whispered. "I swear to you, I'm not." Amani's breath shuddered, and that single tremor was all he needed. His lips touched hers, soft at first, tentative, as though he feared she might vanish if he pressed too hard. The kiss was warm, slow, a quiet question he wasn't sure he had the right to ask. Amani's fingers curled into his shirt, meaning to stop him, but instead they tightened, pulling him closer. His other hand slid to the small of her back, not claiming, but anchoring, like he needed the contact to stay standing. The kiss deepened, still gentle but growing with the kind of restrained hunger that came from nights of silence and days of pretending. He kissed her like she was a truth he had been starving for, a truth he didn't dare take without reverence. And God help her, Amani kissed him back. The world outside blurred into rain and thunder. The only thing real was the warmth of him, the steady weight of his hands, the way he exhaled shakily when her lips parted beneath his. He kissed her deeper, then still slow, still controlled, but with a growing fire that made her knees weaken, a fire she felt all the way to her fingertips. Her mind screamed at her to stop, to think, to remember why she came here. But her body had already surrendered. She had lost the moment he touched her, the moment he whispered her name like it meant something, the moment she realized he was telling the truth. And that truth changed everything she thought she knew. When the kiss finally broke, Ethan's forehead rested against hers, his breath unsteady. "Amani," he whispered, as though afraid the silence would break her away from him. "I don't want to be something that hurts you." Her heartbeat throbbed painfully against her ribs. "Then don't be." He let out a soft, broken sound, half a laugh, half a confession. "I don't know how to do this. Not anymore." "Neither do I." Their breaths mingled, their hearts raced, and for a suspended moment, there was no scandal, no Edward, no lies, no ghosts, only two people standing too close, holding on to each other like the world outside was falling apart. Because in a way, it was. Amani stepped back first, barely, her fingers trembling as they slipped from his shirt. "Ethan, this changes things. It should," he murmured, eyes tracing her face as though memorizing every line. "But not in the way you fear." She didn't answer. She couldn't. Because even though the kiss felt like truth, everything else felt like a storm waiting to swallow her. She turned away slowly, resisting the pull to stay in his arms. Ethan didn't stop her. He watched her walk down the hallway, rain still hammering the windows, the thunder murmuring like a warning neither of them understood. And Amani knew with chilling certainty Harper was right about one thing. Ethan could break her heart, not because he wanted to, but because he was the first man she had ever wanted to believe. The morning after the storm tasted like the kind of quiet that comes before something breaks. Hawthorne Estate was still dripping with rain, the windows streaked silver, the sky heavy with unspoken warnings. Ethan barely noticed any of it. He had not slept. He had stood in his study through the long hours of dawn, replaying the memory of Amani's lips against his, the warmth of her breath, the trembling in her hands when she whispered that things had changed. They had. But not in the way she feared, not in the way he feared either. For the first time in years, he had allowed himself to hope. And then the call came. His private investigator's voice was urgent, breathless, each word slicing through the fragile calm Ethan had tried to build. We found him. Ethan's grip tightened around the edge of his desk. Edward alive, the investigator confirmed. Hidden under an alias, overseas, for years. And we have evidence he orchestrated the entire scandal, your downfall. The financial destruction, the cover-up. Everything traces back to him. Ethan felt the world tilt, as if the floor had shifted beneath him. But the investigator didn't stop. There's more. The connection to Amani's mother, it wasn't random. Edward had contact with her. He was involved in her case. Whatever happened to her, he caused it. Silence crashed into Ethan, thick and violent. His heartbeat roared in his ears. Edward, his brother, the man he once trusted, the man whose shadow had swallowed nearly a decade of his life. And now this truth that could destroy the last person Ethan wanted to lose. If Amani learns this from anyone else, the investigator added quietly, she'll think you hid it from her. Ethan didn't respond. He didn't need to. He was already running. But fate had never been generous to Ethan Hawthorne, and today, it was merciless. Amani had spent the morning trying to anchor herself after the kiss, after the way her pulse had betrayed her, after the way Ethan held her as though she was something precious instead of a threat. She tried to bury herself in work, to silence the echo of Harper's voice, to forget the photograph of her mother with Edward Hawthorne. But something kept clawing at her, an unease growing like a bruise beneath her ribs. When her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number, she almost ignored it. But one sentence, glowing coldly on the screen, froze her blood. The man you're falling for isn't innocent. He knew everything from the start. Amani stared, breath thinning, lungs tightening around invisible fingers. The hallway blurred, her pulse hammered in her ears. He knew everything. Her chest clenched painfully. She read the message again and again, each repetition carving deeper. Hadn't Harper said Ethan was capable of breaking her? Hadn't Amani already suspected him from the moment she arrived? Hadn't her mother's warning been absolute? Unquestionable. Amani tried to breathe around the rising panic, but the walls seemed to close in. She needed answers, but the thought of facing Ethan now, when her heart was already fraying, felt like walking straight into a fire she was no longer sure she could survive. She turned and ran. Ethan reached her room a minute too late. He pushed the door open with a force that shook the hinges, his chest heaving, his thoughts spiraling. But the room was empty. The linens neatly folded, the suitcase gone. Panic sparked hard in his chest. A door slammed down the hall. He sprinted after the sound and found her at the main landing, breathless, her eyes bright with something he had prayed never to see again. Fear, pain, betrayal. Amani, he called, breath cracking. She froze but didn't turn. Ethan stepped into the hallway, rain lights spilling over him in fractured gray and gold. Please, stop. Slowly, she faced him. The look in her eyes hit him harder than any physical blow. You knew. Ethan's heart dropped. Amani. Don't lie to me, she said, her voice shaking. Someone sent me a message. They said you knew everything about Edward, about the scandal, about what happened to my mother. Her fingers tightened around the railing, knuckles white, as if she needed the cold metal to keep herself standing. You said you weren't my enemy, but you hid this. You hid him. I didn't know until this morning, Ethan said quickly, desperately. I swear to you, I didn't. You expect me to believe that? Her voice broke on the last word. Ethan stepped closer, though every instinct screamed at him that any movement might push her further away. "I was coming to tell you," he said. "I ran straight to your room when I found out. I would never hide something like this from you." Her gaze wavered, pain flickering behind her anger. "Why didn't you tell me the moment you suspected? Because I wasn't protecting myself." Ethan said, "I was protecting you." Amani shook her head, tears burning the corners of her eyes, protecting me from what his jaw clenched, grief and guilt mingling in his voice. From the fact that the man who hurt you, the man who destroyed your family, was my brother. Amani's breath hitched. For a moment she looked as though the floor had collapsed under her feet. "Ethan." He reached for her hand, not to hold it, but to ask, to beg. But she pulled back. "Don't." The word was sharp, pained. He froze. Amani swallowed hard, her voice barely steady. "You should have told me the truth before I heard it from someone else. That's what hurts. I'm trying to make this right." Ethan whispered, "But you're pulling away before I can even explain." "Because I don't know what's real anymore," she whispered. "Not with you." Ethan's chest caved inward. Everything in him reached for her, every instinct, every emotion he didn't know he was capable of. But she turned away, the distance between them widening like an open wound. "Amani." His voice broke. "Please don't leave like this. I have to." "No." He stepped forward, raw and unguarded. "You don't. Let me fix this." She shook her head, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. "Some things can't be fixed." Ethan felt the words cut deep, exact, merciless. "Amani," he whispered, "look at me." She didn't. If she did, she knew she would shatter. And if she shattered, she might stay. And staying might destroy her. "Goodbye, Ethan." The words were a whisper and a blade. Then she walked away from him down the grand staircase, through the glass doors, into the cold morning rain, leaving Ethan in the center of the hallway, drowning in the silence she left behind. The storm had passed outside, but inside him, one had just begun. 3 days passed like a season of grief. Hawthorne Estate felt colder, emptier, its halls echoing with a silence Ethan couldn't outrun. He barely ate. He barely slept. He spent hours staring at the door Amani had once walked through, replaying every moment he could have told her the truth, every moment he could have reached for her and didn't. And then the world caught fire. News alerts exploded across every channel. Edward Hawthorne, long presumed dead, returns amid scandal, accuses his brother Ethan of betrayal. Clips played of Edward stepping out of a black car, older now, sharper, smiling like a man who enjoyed chaos as much as he enjoyed victory. "Ethan tried to ruin me," he said to cameras. "He always envied me. Now he wants to erase me." Ethan watched silently as the media devoured the lie. His lawyers called, his board called. Reporters swarmed the gates, but Ethan didn't defend himself. He didn't hold a press conference or release a statement. The world was burning his name again, and he let it. Because there was only one person he wanted to explain himself to. Only one person who mattered. And she wasn't here. Amani had spent the last 3 days in turmoil so deep she didn't recognize herself. She had replayed every moment with Ethan, not the kisses, not the warmth, but the silences, the moments he hesitated, the heaviness he carried. the apology in his eyes when he didn't say enough. She reread the anonymous message until the words blurred. But when she found the file, a leather-bound folder hidden carefully beneath Ethan's own legal documents, her world shattered and rebuilt in a single heartbeat. Inside were records of the original scandal, timelines marked in Ethan's own handwriting, and correspondence showing he had refused to give investigators her mother's name, even though doing so would have cleared him instantly. He had protected her mother. He had protected her. Ethan had known Edward was involved years ago, but had shielded Amani from the truth because she was still grieving, still raw, still too breakable to face the man who had torn her family apart. He hadn't lied to her. He hadn't deceived her. He had carried the blame because she wasn't ready for the real villain. And the moment Amani understood that truly understood it, her breath left her in a sob that felt like breaking and healing at once. She grabbed her keys. She didn't think. She simply ran. They found each other at the place she least expected, the beach her mother used to visit, the one she had spoken about in soft memories, where the waves seemed to remember her. The sky was bruised with late afternoon gold when Amani arrived, wind tugging at her clothes, her pulse pounding in her throat. She saw Ethan before he saw her standing near the shoreline, shoulders tense, hair whipped by the wind, a man who looked like he had been carrying the weight of the ocean on his back. She stepped toward him. Sand shifted beneath her feet. The wind carried her voice before she was ready. Ethan. He turned so fast it nearly broke her heart. His eyes were red-rimmed, exhausted, desperate and impossibly relieved. Amani. Her name left him like a prayer someone had nearly stolen from him. She stopped in front of him, breath trembling. "You didn't tell me," she said quietly, painfully. "Not because you wanted to lie, but because you were afraid I would break." Ethan swallowed hard, jaw tight with emotion. "I should have told you anyway. You should have," she whispered. "But you didn't, because you weren't trying to protect yourself." Her voice cracked. "You were trying to protect me." He closed his eyes for a moment, fighting the tremor in his breath. "I was terrified," he admitted, "terrified of losing you before I ever had the chance to keep you." Amani moved closer, the wind swirling her hair across her face. She reached up, hesitating only a moment before touching his cheek. His breath hitched softly at the contact. "Is that why you didn't tell me about Edward?" she asked. Ethan nodded, his voice rough. "I didn't want you to relive what he did to your family, to your mother. I didn't want you to look at me and see his shadow." Her thumb brushed along his jaw, gentle, trembling. "Ethan, I've lost too much already. I don't want to lose you too." Something inside him shattered in the quietest, most beautiful way. He stepped into her touch, his hand coming up to hold her wrist, as though afraid she might disappear with the tide. "Amani," he whispered, voice breaking. "You are the one thing in my life I chose with my heart. Not my name, not my power, not my legacy. Just my heart." Amani's eyes filled, not with grief this time, but with something deeper, something that glowed from within. "Then hear this," she whispered, leaning closer. "I choose you." Ethan exhaled, shaking, disbelieving, undone. He pulled her into his arms with a tenderness that felt like reverence, his lips pressing against her forehead before lowering to her mouth. A kiss that wasn't desperate or reckless, but full of the truth, of the battles they had survived, of the secrets that no longer stood between them. Amani melted into him, her hands gripping the back of his shirt as the waves crashed behind them, the world dissolving into salt and wind and warmth. When their lips parted, Ethan rested his forehead against hers, breathing her in. "Whatever comes next," he murmured, "we face it together." "Together," she echoed. For the first time, the future didn't feel like a storm chasing her, but a horizon waiting for them both. With the truth uncovered and the shadows named, their love didn't fracture, it fortified. Because for the first time, they weren't fighting fate. They were fighting for each other.